Why does Europe need the United States in order to defend Ukraine? Now, for argument's sake, let's put aside all the different opinions on who's right and who's wrong, who you support and who you don't support with respect to the war in Ukraine, and just ask one simple question. Why does a continent as wealthy, sophisticated, and technologically advanced as Europe need help from the United States in order to defend Ukraine? And to answer this question, we're going to consider three major factors which help determine a country's ability to conduct and win a war, namely population size, economy, and military strength. Now, obviously, these are not the only factors that matter, but these factors do matter. And I promise you, Russia no doubt took all of these into consideration before they launched their invasion of Ukraine. Now, clearly, they underestimated the resilience of the Ukrainian people and the willingness of other countries to send Ukraine billions of dollars in aid and military equipment. But having said that, the Russian military is not defeated. In fact, they keep gaining ground, albeit very slowly, and now they appear to be fighting a war of attrition, which in this case strongly favors Russia. And this has led many to suggest that the West, and specifically the United States, must continue to support Ukraine until all of its objectives have been met and Putin is defeated. Now, I'm going to admit my own bias here. I'm no fan of Putin and would be happy to see Ukrainian forces push him all the way back to pre-war boundaries. But it is clear that that will not be achieved by the current level of support that Ukraine is getting, which has caused many to suggest that it is the United States which should step up and provide Ukraine with what is needed to win this war no matter what. But there's a pretty major problem, because what Ukraine needs at this point is not just more money and equipment. They need manpower, because it turns out all of the tanks, Javelin anti-tank missiles, fighter jets, all of it, none of it matters a whole lot if you don't have people qualified to effectively use it in combat. So just who exactly is going to start sending boots on the ground in order to help Ukraine? And the larger question that needs to be asked is, why does it have to be the United States that saves Ukraine when it is Europe that has the most compelling interest and arguably the greater responsibility? Is it because the EU, or Europe in general, lacks the resources? So let's do a quick lineup between Russia and Ukraine and the EU. Russia has approximately 144 million people. It has a GDP of around 2 trillion, and its active duty military is estimated to be somewhere between 1.3 and 1.5 million. Now, Ukraine, on the other hand, has a population of only around 40 million people. They have a GDP of about 180 billion and an active military of around 900,000 personnel. Now, looking at those numbers and realizing that much of this is after mobilization, it's not hard to see why a war between just Ukraine and just Russia is a massive mismatch. But now let's look at the EU. With 27 member states, the EU has a combined population of 449 million people, a GDP of over 20 trillion, and the combined total of its member states' militaries comes to about 1.3 to 1.5 million. So the EU alone has about 3 times the population, 10 times the economic output, and roughly the same size active duty military force as Russia. But Nick, you say, that's not a fair comparison because those numbers are spread out amongst 27 member nations. Okay, fair point. Let's just consider 2 of the largest EU countries. Germany has a population of 84 million, a GDP of 5.7 trillion, and an active military of just 100,000. France has a population of 64 million, a GDP of over 3 trillion, and an active duty force of approximately 200,000. Now, let's add the UK. Now, the UK is not a member of EU, but it has made several commitments to the security of Ukraine. So how does it compare when we add them as well? Well, the UK has a population of 70 million, a GDP of 3.9 trillion, and an active duty military of approximately 138,000. Now, both Germany and France, and then let's just throw in the UK just for fun, all of them have larger economies than Russia. Their populations could support a much larger active duty military force than they currently have. But just to drive the point home a little bit farther, let's compare the EU with the UK and Ukraine versus Russia. Russia, population 144 million, GDP 2 trillion, active duty military 1.3 to 1.5 million. Now compare that with the combined forces of Ukraine, EU, and the UK, and you get a population of 557 million. That's well over 3, close to 4 times the population of Russia. A GDP of approximately 24 trillion. That's about 10 times their GDP. And an active military of approximately 2.2 million, or roughly about 800,000 more people than the Russians have. So the question is, if you want to beat Putin, why don't you go do it? I mean, it appears to me that Europe has all of the manpower and resources and technology necessary in order to defend itself and to assist Ukraine with the necessary resources for it to defend itself against Putin. Why do you require such overwhelming assistance from the United States? Now, could it be that for too long, Western Europe has relied on the military supremacy of the United States and has therefore reprioritized its own budgets towards things like the welfare state, has allowed itself to completely revamp its energy policy based off of the opinions of a 17-year-old Swedish girl, instead of taking into account the very strategic necessity of being able to be independent, or at least not quite so dependent on Russian energy sources? All of these things have been brought up before, but they appear to have been ignored. And now we find ourselves in a situation where Europe is going to have to ask some serious questions, because it's going to have to be capable of providing for its own security rather than relying on the United States.